Hello, this is Vivian Young with 1000 Friends of Florida, and I'd like to welcome you to our Ethics and Planning in Florida webinar. I did want to make one small correction. The PowerPoints that we have posted online, the front page accidentally says 2014 Florida Legislative Wrap-Up. If you'll ignore that first slide, the rest of the contents are correct. We appreciate you coming today, and I'd like to go over a little bit of housekeeping. First of all, we really want to thank the sponsors for our webinars. We've had a lot of support from some very gracious foundations and other sponsors. The Archibald Foundation and Mosaic are Florida patrons. Members of the President's Club include Cobb and Cole, the Perkins Charitable Foundation, the William Howard Flowers Jr. Foundation, and then we'd also like to thank our sponsors, Ronald Book, Dover Cole and Partners, Kitson Evergreen, and Thomas Brock Luger and Company. For those of you who are not familiar, Dr. John M. DeGrove was one of the founders of growth management in Florida, and he's known as the grandfather of growth management, and he was also a founder of 1000 Friends of Florida. We have been doing this series in his honor, and we have a number of upcoming webinars. We're taking a break over the summer to plan for the fall, but topics we're looking into are complete streets, planning for climate change, expanding Florida's system of greenways. If you want to get information on upcoming webinars, you can go to our website at 1000friendsofflorida.org and sign up for our email alerts, and you will get information when we have all the details worked out. And if you have any suggestions for upcoming webinars, you can email me directly at vyoung@1000fof.org. Again, some more housekeeping. You'll have a control panel on your screen, and if you have questions, there is a chat box, and you can chat. You can write your questions in here. At the end of the webinar, I will be asking the presenters to answer the questions, as many as we have time for. You can send them to organizers only, which goes to me, or you can click on this link and you can send them to everybody. And we try to answer as many questions as possible. We do ask that you keep your questions fairly succinct because I need to be able to ask them of the other speakers. This event has been approved for 1.5 AICPCM ethics credits, 1.5 CEHP credits for certified environmental health planners, 1 CEC for certified floodplain managers, and we applied for CLE for Florida attorneys about 5 weeks ago. We still have not heard on that. We will post it on our website if and when we do get the approval for that. The PowerPoint is available for downloading on our website. If you go to 1000friendsofflorida.org, on the right-hand side under What's New, you'll see a link to this webinar, and it has the PowerPoint there. Again, we apologize that the first slide is incorrect, and we have a webinars page, and we will be posting information on upcoming webinars as we get the details confirmed on them. For those of you who aren't familiar with 1000 Friends of Florida, we were founded in 1986, and we focus on saving special places and building better communities. We have a bipartisan board of directors from around the state, and we're on Facebook and Twitter, and we encourage you to follow us there. I would like to turn it over to Charles at this point and ask him to introduce our presenters. Charles, can you hear me?
Yeah, thanks, Vivian. This is Charles Pattison. I'm the Policy Director at 1000 Friends of Florida, and I'm going to introduce our panel speakers in the order that you'll be hearing from them. They all, interestingly, share a distinction as fellows of the American Institute of Certified Planners. I'm going to begin with Val Hubbard. She is a AICP Commissioner since 2008, and she is the Planning Services Director at the Ackerman Law Firm. She's also LEED certified, and she is the incoming president of the American Institute of Certified Planners Commission. She chairs the AICP Ethics Committee. She is a former director of community planning at the former Department of Community Affairs. Also was past president of Florida American Planning Association chapter. She'll be speaking on the APA and AICP Code of Ethics. Following Val will be Susan Trevarthen. She's also a fellow of the American Institute of Certified Planners. She's with the firm of Weiss, Serota, and others. She chairs the Municipal Land Use and Zoning Division there. Her specialties include constitutional law and Byrd-Harris Act claims, as well as local government planning. She serves as a town attorney in one of Broward County's coastal communities. She's a University of North Carolina and Duke University graduate. She's Florida Bar certified and AV rated as well. She'll be speaking on local planning and land use ethics in Florida. And following Susan will be Tom Pelham, another fellow of the American Institute of Certified Planners. Most of you know of his 2 terms of service as Department of Community Affairs Secretary. He has more than 30 years in public and private land use, government, and environmental law. Tom also was a past president of Florida American Planning Association chapter, former faculty member at the SMU Law School. He has degrees from FSU, Duke, and Harvard. He'll be speaking on tweaking your ethical compass. And I'm going to turn it over to Val Hubbard now.
Thanks, Charles. So what I know a lot of you are planners and some of you are not, but apparently you work with planners. Most of you do probably. So I wanted to, they've asked me to go over the guides for ethical planning that we have at the AICP Commission and APA. Next slide, please. So ethics, you know, a lot of people will tell you that ethics is pretty simple. You just do ethics, or what you do when no one's looking, George Bernard Shaw, or whenever you do something, act as though the world were watching, or the one that I've always heard is, how would your mom feel if she read it in the paper? Would you be okay with that? And of course, Mark Twain said, always do right, it'll gratify some people and astonish the rest. Those are great quotes, but ethics really isn't always that simple. Next slide, please. Especially in planning. There's a lot of reasons for this. You know, we work in a profession where the context is different than a lot of other professions. You've got attorneys on the presentation who also act as planners at times, and they would be able to tell you that, for instance, the code of ethics for attorneys is very different than that for planners. We're going to talk a lot about the public interest, and that is at the very core of what we do as planners and of our ethical code. So that makes it a little bit harder, because how do you figure out what the public interest really is? It's not always that clear. Another thing that makes it a little difficult sometimes is that the AICP code has some specific rules of conduct that might not be completely obvious on the front end. And so it's always good to go back and remind yourself of what those actual rules are, particularly the ones that are in the rules of conduct. And I don't think Vivian mentioned it, but there's actually a hyperlink to those guides on the right-hand side on the toolbar for the presentation. Another thing that makes it very difficult is, you know, when we are working as planners, there are a lot of pressures that come to bear. What we do has a lot of effect on the bottom line for a lot of people in business, and it has a lot to do with how politicians are viewed and how their terms go. So we get pressures from all over, and some of those pressures may come from our employers, from our employers' bosses, and that can make it difficult. And finally, we are in an environment where things can happen very quickly. If we don't spend the time to think about these things ahead of time, if we don't know what the rules are, and if we haven't really kind of honed our moral compass, then it becomes very difficult to react quickly in the appropriate way. Next slide, please. So when we do these sessions on ethics, and this one has been approved, I think, for credits, we like to tell people it's great to talk about these things in advance. That's part of how we get this broader understanding of how these ethical codes, these rules need to be applied. But only the ethics officer is authorized to give formal advice on the propriety of a certified planner's conduct. So we really encourage you, if you find yourself in a situation where you think you need an answer, you need to get in touch with the ethics officer. That currently is Paul Farmer, who is the executive director of APA. That may change in the future because Paul's leaving, but if you call if you call APA AICP, they're going to put you in touch with someone who can give you some advice, and you can get informal advice pretty quickly. Next slide. I've been talking about how planning is a little bit different than some of the other professions. This is nothing against the other professions. It's just that planning is really, really special. We had a presentation from a Harvard professor at one of our APA conferences, and he was entitled Planning the Noble Profession. I think it's on the web still. But he pointed out that planning is really, at the foundation of democracy, civic life. It is a way that we really improve communities and cultivate democratic citizens. So he pointed out planning is a profession that is inherently connected to the democratic profession. Next slide. So how is planning different exactly? Next slide. Okay, well, some of our special circumstances make it different. I've talked about that a little bit. But one of the reasons why our code is different probably is because most planners are public sector employees. Not all of us. I'm not any longer, although I was for most of my career. But it makes a difference, I think, in the overall perspective of the profession. Also, we always are dealing with broad long-term issues. We are the ones who help our communities look into the future and really understand the implications of immediate actions. Another difference is that it's not a science. Public input is essential because it's all about community preferences, the implication for communities, what do people want for their communities. So we're not like engineers. We can't just rely on a formula and even an adopted rule, because usually we're balancing interests. As you know, in your conference of plans, there's one thing that tells you to do one thing and something that implies you should do something else, and a lot of times there's nothing that gives strict guidance on which of these interests should take precedence. So these all make our jobs harder when it comes to doing the right thing. Next slide. So the implications of that are, number one, we may run into some problems as we're working with other professions, or if you're an attorney and you're working as an attorney and you're also a planner, that can create an ethical issue for you as well. Private sector planners do have a special challenge because they're, as we'll get into, we have a duty to our clients, and we have the duty of the public interest. The public interest always has to take precedence, but again, we have to develop our understanding of the public interest and really weigh those different, balance those interests. as you know, even though you may be a public sector planner instead of a private sector planner, even your bosses don't always put public interest first. And they're the ones that are charged with making final decisions, but we're the ones that are charged with making sure they understand the implications of those decisions. Next. To help us with this, we have a couple of different guides. We have the APA Ethical Principles in Planning, and that is one that you don't hear a lot about, but it's really developed for all planning participants. I'll talk about that very briefly. Then we have the AICP Code of Ethics and Professional Conduct, which is for certified planners, and that is broken into aspirational principles and the rules of conduct. Next slide. The ethical principles in planning, first of all, I want to say that it's a great idea to get your hands on these and actually distribute them out in your place of employment. Give a copy to the planning participants. Make sure your boss knows what the code of conduct says and your aspirational principles, so that they can understand not only is this the way that they should act, this is the way you have to act. And it's the guide for your conduct, so they will understand you a little better. The ethical principles in planning, as I said, are for anyone who participates in planning, including elected officials, your citizen advocates, and so forth. And it sort of mirrors, to some extent, the aspirational principles in our code. The planning process must continuously pursue and faithfully serve the public interest. That is the basic premise on which all this is founded. It's found in the ethical principles. It's found in our code. It talks about planning process participants trying to achieve high standards of integrity and proficiency so that public respect for the planning process will be maintained. You will see that a lot in our code as well. Anything that we do that reflects negatively upon the planning process is something we need to try to avoid. And then it talks also about practicing planners continuously pursuing improvement in their planning competence and helping to mentor their peers and aspiring planners. Next page. So that was the ethical principles in planning, but I'm going to talk for a little while now about the Code of Ethics and Professional Conduct, which is our basic code as certified planners. The aspirational principles we'll talk about are what we should aspire to. The rules of conduct are what we must follow. And then at the end, there is a process for handling charges of ethical misconduct. Next. The aspirational principles are divided into our responsibility to the public, our responsibility to clients and employers, and our responsibility to the profession and colleagues. Next page. Our responsibility to the public, I think we need to spend a little bit more time on this because, again, this is what sets us apart. This is what makes us different as planners. I've looked at the codes of the other professions, and it's not that they don't have something in there about serving the public interest, but it is not the absolute sort of foundation on which they're based. And as I mentioned earlier, one of the tricky parts about this is how do you come to an understanding of the public interest? That our code says we have to owe our allegiance to a conscientiously attained concept of the public interest. So it's not something we can look at casually. We have to really work at that. And a part of that is our being conscious of the rights of others. We mentioned special concern for the long-range consequences of present actions and attention to interrelatedness of decisions. These are things that really don't become a part of the code of ethics of many other professions. Next slide. Then there are some things that timely, clear, and accurate information. That's something I think a lot of professions share. We have a special duty to ensure meaningful participation, especially for those who lack influence, and seeking social justice. Those are very specific to our profession, and I think, you know, if you approach the code of conduct just looking at the rules that are more objective type rules, like the timely, clear, and accurate information, design excellence, and things like that, we miss the point of being planners. Next page. Of course, we're weighing that with our responsibility to the client employer, with the public interest always coming first, but we do have to provide diligent, creative, and competent performance. And again, it says specifically consistent with faithful service to the public interest. We are to accept the decisions of a client unless the action is illegal or inconsistent with the public interest. And we should avoid accepting assignment conflicts of interest or even the appearance of conflicts. And I think you're going to hear more about that from some of the other presenters today. Next page. Then we have this responsibility to profession. I mentioned earlier the idea of always trying to protect the sort of the perception of the profession, make sure that people see the process, the planning process, as having integrity and something they can trust. So there are a number of aspirational principles that deal with this as well. Next page. One of the things we've mentioned is mentoring, and here we see contributing time and resources to the professional development of others. We should be recruiting the underrepresented to become planners, and we should continue to analyze ethical issues in the practice of planning, which is what we're doing right now. Next page. So how we must act. If these are the rules of conduct, I'm going to go over them very briefly, but these are where the rules for which you can receive sanctions and you can lose your AICP certification if you do not act in accordance with them. Next page. I've kind of grouped these into some themes. Actually, Connie Cooper, whom some of you may know, this was her idea, but I think it helps us keep in mind, if we can group it into themes, it's a little bit easier to get our arms around the 26 or so rules of conduct. And it comes down to, we shouldn't do things that are illegal, we shouldn't do things that aren't truthful, we can't do things that are unprofessional, that affect public confidence, or that hinder enforcement of code. And then it's important to recognize that at the end there is a catch-all for everything else that didn't fall under all the other rules. Next page. Very quickly. Conduct that's in essence illegal. If you look through these, the number at the end, and these are very much summarized, number at the end is the rule that we're actually that is in the rules of conduct. It's the number. So accepting assignments that involve conduct that's illegal or violates code, you can't do illegal stuff. I mean, that's the bottom line. You just can't do it. Accepting outside compensation or advantage related to our public employment, shouldn't take kickbacks, for instance. As a public employee or official, talking privately with a planning participant when we shouldn't, when it's prohibited, or talking privately with decision makers when it's prohibited. These are government in the sunshine type violations. Then unlawfully discriminating against others. I know of very few planners who would do this, but it's definitely against the rules. Next page. Conduct that's less than truthful. And by the way, I want to tell you that there's a lot of overlap between these. A lot of these could fit in more than one of these categories. But we need to represent our credentials correctly. We need to represent the qualifications and findings of other professionals truthfully. We cannot use the anything that's less than truthful to promote ourselves. We can't plagiarize. We can't direct or coerce others to make findings not supported by evidence. This does not mean that as a planning director you can't correct the staff report of your junior planner, but it means that you have to be careful, because you, in doing so, you really cannot coerce them to do something that is politically expedient when there is not evidence there to support it. And there's ways to deal with that, obviously. One that is something I actually did not realize for the longest time was you cannot fail to disclose your employer's interests, or you can't participate in concealing your employer's interests in the planning process, because that can subvert the planning process. And you must notify the ethics officer if you are convicted of a serious crime. Next slide. Conduct that's unprofessional, clearly failing to provide adequate, timely, clear, and accurate information. How easy is that to do, actually? That's pretty easy to do. There's a prohibition against, sort of changing your position within a certain period of time without getting permission from your past employer. You can't moonlight with or without pay unless you get approval. You must not work beyond your competence unless it's disclosed and agreed that the work will be performed by others. And this is the one that I think is really easy to get into, is accepting work you can't finish by the required deadline. That's actually against the code. Next. Conduct affecting public confidence. Working on a project where you're going to get something out of it without there being disclosure and consent from your employer. You have to be careful with confidential information. You cannot disclose confidential information unless there are certain circumstances in which you can do it, but in most circumstances you cannot. Again, using the power of your position to seek a special advantage, selling services by implying that you can influence a decision by improper means. But as I said, a violation of many of our rules will affect public confidence, so they kind of all fall into this category. Next. Conduct that hinders enforcement of the AICP code. There are certain requirements that center around how we handle enforcement of the code, and you need to be aware of those and abide by them if it should come up. Next. This is the one that says, this is the catch-all. It says, we shall not neither deliberately or with reckless indifference commit any wrongful act, whether or not specified in the rules of conduct, that reflects adversely on our professional fitness. So just because it's not in the rules of conduct specifically doesn't mean you can do something that you know is wrong. Obviously, you're not going to do that. Next. As I pointed out, you have the Code of Ethics and Professional Conduct, the ethical principles here. You can get to them on the website. And that is the end of my presentation. I'm turning it over to Susan Trevarthen. Thank you.
Thank you, Val. I'm particularly honored to be here today as part of the DeGrove webinar series, knowing that my whole time in planning started with Dr. DeGrove in 1986. So I appreciate 1,000 Friends for pulling this together, and am happy to be part of it. Next slide, please. So I've been asked to look at the ethics laws that are relevant to local land use practice. And this is actually a pretty large area, so you should not walk away from this presentation thinking that you have every detail. But what you do have is a roadmap and a reminder of the things that you may already know, and perhaps you know a little bit more about what's out there than you do before the webinar began. So first of all, what are our sources of law? We have a local diversity in this state, and a system of overlapping laws in several areas of the state. So we start with the state statute, which applies uniformly to all. That's Chapter 112. That sets forth the ethics rules that govern both public officials and public employees. There were some recent amendments to that. In many of our large urban counties, we have, especially charter counties, we have county-wide ethics rules. Right now in South Florida, where I work, Palm Beach County has its own ethics system, Broward has its own ethics system, and Miami-Dade has its own ethics system, and there are even more around the state. The third level of a source of law is local municipal ethics rules. Some of our towns and cities have gone further than either state or county regulations and adopted something stricter. And finally, we do have local aspirational codes of conduct, which are similar to the aspirational principles under AICP that Val has described. So the key concept of this presentation is we're talking about laws here, laws that have potentially criminal penalties, certainly financial penalties, and there are laws that govern how laws get written. They must be clear, objective minimums. They can't be very broadly stated, generalized, aspirational goals. So you may be underwhelmed with some of the content of some of these laws, but I think some of that flows from we're writing bare minimums that are legally enforceable. We're not writing aspirational requirements at this time. And there are varying requirements depending on who you are. So are you a state public official or a local public official? Are you elected? Are you appointed? Are you employed? Are you a former employed person from a public position? All those nuances will affect how these laws apply to you. Next slide, please. Our themes: we're avoiding situations where a public official's public duty and personal interest are at odds, including interactions with related business entities and relatives, not just the person themselves. The second theme is timely public disclosure of potential reasons why one's public duty may be compromised. The third theme is requirements for training and systems for advice giving so that it is possible to avoid problems if someone is attempting to be ethical and to comply. And finally, enforcement by some kind of independent entity that assures that the rules are followed. Next slide, please. So our first law is the Voting Conflicts of Interest Law. It's of interest not only to our elected and appointed officials, but also, of course, to private applicants who are wanting to see votes be taken on their projects. And there is a rule that officers cannot vote if it would inure to the officer's special private gain or loss, or that similarly affects their client, their relative, or their business associate. Next slide, please. So for a long time we didn't know what special private gain or loss precisely was, but last year the ethics statutes were changed and we now have a definition in the statute that reflects many years of opinions from the Florida Ethics Commission and case law and other sources. So it means economic benefit or harm. And one of the challenging issues in applying the conflict of interest standard is how to measure this if the officer is part of a class that's affected by the vote or the action. The question that we often get as local government attorneys or ethics professionals is, think for example about your elected official. By definition, someone who lives in your city is the only one who is eligible to run for office. And so they're sitting there on the dais and they're going to take a vote that sets the tax rate. They're required by law to do that. That ad valorem tax rate affects the house that they own in that community. All of these things are legally mandated. Is that a conflict of interest? And the answer is no, because the interests that are shared are in common with every other property owner in the city. And so when you take that concept and you apply it to closer cases, what you want to look at is the size of the class. Is this vote involving a neighborhood that only has 12 homes and they own one of the homes and that neighborhood has a special benefit or detriment? That's different than if they're part of a larger neighborhood that's not physically distinct or cut off from other areas and more people are affected in the same way that they are. So the nature of the interests that are shared is important. The degree of impact. Do you live across the street from the property? Do you live 5 blocks away in the same neighborhood? All of these things may be relevant to the determination. Of course, the nature of any benefit or burden that's received, and finally the degree of uncertainty as to whether this benefit or harm will arise, and if it is uncertain, what is the nature or degree? Next slide, please. It's important to notice that we have different rules under the statute for appointed boards and elected boards. So appointed boards, like your Board of Adjustment or your Planning and Zoning Board, those members, when they declare a conflict of interest, by statute they cannot participate in the discussion of the item. Under state law, in contrast, members of governing bodies, elected officials, are allowed to participate in the discussion even when they disclose the conflict of interest and file the paperwork. They just have to recuse themselves from voting. They do, however, need to be careful to avoid the separate statute on misuse of position, and there are localities with rules that are different. For example, the Miami-Dade County Code requires elected officials not to participate in the discussion. Next slide, please. So what do you do if there's a conflict? If there is a conflict, the public officer must publicly announce it and file a memorandum of voting conflict with the clerk that discloses the nature of the interest. If the conflict is discovered later, then it must be filed within 15 days of when it's discovered. So next slide, please. Another issue that's a state law minimum is nepotism. And so public officials who are elected and appointed, not appointed, just elected, as well as employees are affected by this. It applies to relatives, which is broadly defined, and the public official or employee may not seek employment, appointment, promotion, advancement in the agency that the person is serving or over which the person exercises jurisdiction and control. The rule is not applicable to volunteers. And supervision by a relative is not a violation. It's more the employment decision. Next slide, please. Gift and financial disclosure. We have Form 1 and Form 6, which are the forms that are completed by county and city local government officials each summer to disclose. Public officers and certain public employees have to file these disclosures. The gift restrictions apply to commissioners and board members, and there's this, as you see on the slide before you, list of amounts, and depending on the amount that's at issue and depending on the kind of person or the type of interest that's offering the gift, that either reporting is or is not required, and it changes who has to do that reporting. So it's important to be aware of those rules depending on how they affect you. Next slide. This is elected and appointed board members. It does not apply to citizen advisory boards or technical coordinating committees. And then you see there the list of individual employees who are affected by this gift regulation of state law. Next slide, please. Form 1 is the municipal form. Form 6 is the county form. It's every summer by July. Some of the recent innovations in the state law have been elected officials are now allowed to create a blind trust. Electronic disclosures are now available. And there's a free do-over, essentially. If you file by July 1st and you find that there's a problem, you can fix it if it's de minimis by September 1st. Next slide, please. Gifts that are seeking to influence the public official, the public employee, or the public attorney. This provision of statute applies to all those types of people and requires that they not accept anything of value when they know or should know with the exercise of reasonable care that it's being given to influence the vote or other official action. And this rule applies not only to the official or the regulated person, but also the spouse and minor children of that person. Next slide, please. Misuse of public position. This again applies to public officials, employees, and public attorneys. You may not corruptly use or attempt to use your position to obtain a special privilege for self or for another. Next slide, please. disclosure or use of information by public officials, employees, and attorneys. You may not disclose or use information that's not available to the public and is obtained by reason of your position for personal benefit or the benefit of others. And that, as you can see, there's some similarity in the things that we've talked about with some of the AICP rules. Next slide, please. Soliciting and accepting honoraria or payments for speaking engagements and appearances. Reporting people who have to actually file those financial reports, Form 1 or Form 6, and procurement employees are subject to this restriction. Next slide, please. Public officials or purchasing employees who are doing business with the local government. If they're acting in their official capacity, they may not purchase, rent, or lease any realty goods or services for the local government from a business entity in which they own more than a 5% interest or a controlling interest as an officer, director, or partner. When you're acting in your private capacity, on the flip side of that transaction, you may not sell, lease, or rent any realty goods or services to your local government that you serve. There are a couple of exceptions. If this becomes of concern to you, you should follow up. Next slide. Conflicting employment for public officers and employees. The statute requires that you not have employment or contracts with an entity doing business with or regulated by the local government. Now, this is interpreted in light of the rules of interpretation and construction of the Florida Ethics Code. In the last bullet here, you'll see that it shall not be construed to prevent the ability to have any employment as long as that employment doesn't interfere with the faithful discharge of duties. And so to provide an example, just one I ran into this week and I frequently run into, the Miami-Dade County Code of Ethics has a specific rule for if you have a board of architects like Coral Gables or other cities have that addresses the fact that those professionals are serving in that capacity and yet will be representing clients in the community, and allows them to do that and to step down and be able to represent an applicant before that board. So next slide, please. Public employment by elected officials or candidates. These are new requirements, and so think of someone like a school teacher or a police officer or someone who works for any level of government also seeking to become an elected official. That's what we're talking about here. There are new rules that prohibit dual employment unless, just boiling it down, it's got to be a real job, not a made-up job just so the elected official can be employed. And we all, I think, can remember recent controversies out of Tallahassee related to this, and probably the reason why we have this statute. There is a rule about continued employment. What if you've been acting in that capacity for 20 years before you run for office? You may continue to be employed as long as your promotion, your advancement, and your additional compensation is not given just because of your status as an elected official. And also there is a rule under Florida law that employees may not hold office in the government where they work. Next slide, please. Lobbying by former officials. The state law standard on this is that former elected officials may not personally lobby the government which they served for compensation for 2 years following their service. There are no statutory rules for employees or appointed board members, but you should check your local laws because there are many out there that impose the same 2-year prohibition or perhaps even a more stringent prohibition. Next slide, please. What are the penalties for violating the State Code of Ethics? These are listed as they're set forth in the statute. Basically, it's limitation of your office or potentially complete removal from office, financial fines, dismissal. Next slide, please. So it's a range of penalties that are available. The Florida Commission on Ethics, which is the entity in Tallahassee that oversees and implements and interprets the Florida statute on ethics, was historically complaint-driven, and for a number of years people would complain that unless there was a complaint, they couldn't take action, even if there was a story all over the front pages of the newspaper and something that was perceived to be very outrageous. But if no one took the initiative to file the complaint with the Florida Commission on Ethics, they could do nothing. Now, upon a vote of 6 members after the recent changes to the law, the Ethics Commission may investigate upon a referral from a governor, FDLE, state, or U.S. attorney. There are also rules about filing a complaint within 30 days of an election, because many times this will be done for more of a political reason than for an ethical reason, and what is required is that that complaint be based on personal knowledge if it's within that 30-day period. Finally, the statute authorizes dismissal of a complaint or referral at any stage if there's a de minimis violation or just an unintentional error. Next slide. Here are some of the things that our legislature considered in terms of changing our ethics laws, which did not pass in the recent legislative session. We shall see if they come back. They thought about having a different conflict form that would just be a certificate of recusal rather than a declaration of a conflict. They also looked at rules for fining people who willfully disclose a preliminary investigation during the time before it becomes public. Also a standard that if you rely in good faith on legal counsel, that you would be immunized against further enforcement. And finally, interestingly, in light of all of the local types of ethics rules I've mentioned, they looked at preempting the ability for a political subdivision of the state to prohibit them from imposing additional or more stringent standards of conduct and disclosures on another political subdivision. So for example, the county systems of ethics I've spoken about, they apply within the cities of those counties, and if this were to pass, it would preempt, or at least there would be litigation over whether it successfully preempted those rules. Next slide, please. So those countywide ethics rules I've been mentioning, it's a growing trend in large urban counties in our state. For the opinion giving, training, or counseling function, they have different rules. Sometimes there's an ethics commission, sometimes there's an individual officer, sometimes it's the local attorney who's doing that. On the enforcement side, it's usually some kind of inspector general who prosecutes and audits. There is potential applicability within municipalities as well as to staff, not just to elected officials. Next slide, please. So what are examples of some of these kind of countywide ethics rules? Lobbyist registration and disclosures are very common in South Florida and in some other areas around the state. Every time you come to meet with someone and it meets the definition of lobbying, you need to actually sign in and disclose what it's about, and those logs become publicly accessible. There are also additional kinds of disclosures that get added. One in particular in the Broward County Code of Ethics, which just was implemented in 2012. It requires elected officials to disclose their outside employment and the amount of remuneration or compensation received from that employment each year. Form 1 and Form 6, which we mentioned earlier, which are the state disclosures of financial interest, are much more generalized. This is actually a requirement to say exactly what it is that you're being compensated for within the bounds of that definition under Broward codes. Stricter gift rules. I am familiar with cities as well as the Broward County Code of Ethics with a zero tolerance for gifts. In the Broward case, the zero tolerance applies to vendors, contractors, and potential vendors. And while this kind of rule has the benefit of clarity, you know, zero is zero and there's not a lot of argument about what zero is, it does have unintended consequences, and we hear a lot about that because it turns out that every unit of government has contracts with other units of government, and so we all get into the position where our elected officials who are trying to act intergovernmentally are affected by this, but there are ways to deal with it. There's also the potential for stricter outside employment rules. That's also in the Broward system, where electeds and their relatives may not act as lobbyists for other local governments in Broward County. And finally, there can be stricter enforcement of conflicts of interest in voting. As I mentioned in Dade, the electeds must not participate in discussing matters which they have a conflict. Next slide, please. Municipal ethic rules. This is also something to be aware of. As I mentioned, zero gift bans are definitely out there. Sometimes there's stricter standards for voting conflict of interest. Sometimes there's standards for participating in an executive session if there's a conflict of interest. These first two are ones I'm familiar with from a city that had an issue where a person on the dais was involved with an organization that was suing the city, and so that became a concern for them. Sometimes there are stricter campaign contribution limits than there are in state law. There can be prohibitions from those campaign contributors being considered for government work. There can be requirements for disclosing charitable and political fundraising activities. And finally, limits on the use of office accounts. Many small municipalities don't have that. When you get to the large urban county level, individual elected officials sometimes have very substantial budgets for their office, and that's an area that sometimes is subject to ethical rules. Next slide, please. Finally, there are local aspirational codes of conduct out there. I'm using some examples from one that I worked with on a particular community, but you can see that the spirit and the tone of these is much more like the aspirational principles that Val mentioned that are applicable to planners. Serving constituents in a conscientious and diligent manner, committed to performing the functions of office with integrity, avoiding the improper use of influence, conflicts, performing your duties in a manner that promotes public confidence. Many similarities to the things that we were discussing in Val's presentation. Next slide, please. Also, these can include requirements to serve the public interest, to conduct yourself with professionalism, and importantly, in the situation I'm familiar with, refrain from personal agendas, attacks, or intimidation. Sometimes the politics in all of our communities can get very heated, and this was a situation where after that sort of environment arose, a group of elected officials wanted to set themselves the standard of not engaging in that anymore, and they did that with a local code of conduct. Next slide. Now, when you're talking aspiration, by definition, you're not talking a law. You're not talking this very clear, enforceable standard. The commission is the sole judge of any deviations, and generally the accountability is within that same body, because there's really, within your local community, there's no one above your commission. Next slide, please. So with that said, I will turn the presentation over to Tom.
Good afternoon. It's an honor to participate with Val and Susan in this webinar in honor of John DeGrove. Val and Susan have done an excellent job in discussing some of the requirements of the AICP Code of Ethics and state and legislative ethics legislation. My focus is going to be a bit different, although it overlaps in some ways with their presentations. I'm going to address the aspirational, ethical, and moral values that are fundamental to our democratic form of governance, over and above the requirements of ethics codes adopted by legislatures and professional associations. Val noted the close relationship historically between planning and democracy. And I think what I want to talk about is how do we maintain support and confidence in our system of governance? How do we maintain and keep our democratic system? What are the values that we should pursue and act in accordance with to achieve those objectives? Next slide, please. I've given a summary of my experience in the public realm, not to reveal how old I am, but to indicate that over a long period of time, I've had the opportunity to observe up close and personal how public agencies and officials and private sector actors conduct themselves and interact with each other in our democratic system. One of the things that I have witnessed during that long period of time is the changing ethical landscape in which we work. Next slide, please. I think it's already there. There are a number of reasons for this changing ethical environment. The ethical challenges and temptations that we face today are greater than ever, due in part to the corrosive impact of big money, pervasive influence of lobbyists for special private interests, pay-to-play politics and governance. If you don't contribute, you don't get to play. The complexity of issues and legislation, which makes it very difficult for the ordinary citizen who can't afford high-powered lobbyists to understand and participate in the business of government. The complexity of issues and legislation is something that is, I think, very troublesome for citizens at large. And finally, lack of respect for law and government. It raises the question of what can we do to reform the system, to address the abuses, to make sure that we continue to act consistent with the democratic values on which this nation was founded. I've sort of looked back on my experience and tried to identify lessons that I think I learned and eventually benefited from over the years. Next slide, please. Lesson number one. If we are in a position of responsibility and authority and supervision in the public realm, we must have a personal moral compass geared to the ethical values that are essential to good democratic government. And of course, we're talking about democratic with a small d. These values are integrity, honesty, and truthfulness, transparency, openness, and accountability, fairness and inclusiveness, avoiding even the appearance of impropriety, conflict of interest, and politically motivated decisions that are not in accordance with the law, and finally, obedience to the law. These are essential values in a democratic system of government. They are values to work by, and if adhered to, will inspire confidence in our governmental process. We must always uphold these values, and we have an obligation to demand that people who are participating in the system respect and follow these values. Next slide. Number two, the ethical tone of an agency is set at the top. I repeat, the ethical tone of a public governmental entity is set by the person at the top through their actions and directions, by the person who in effect is the chief executive officer, have a special responsibility to set the proper ethical and moral tone. I was very fortunate to work for two governors who not only allowed the agency I and my fellow agency heads headed to do the right thing in accordance with the law, but insisted that we do the right thing under the law, and from day one of their administrations set the ethical and moral tone that they wanted to characterize their administrations. There is nothing more demoralizing, at least in my experience, to agency staffs than to be directed to take action that is contrary to law or their professional ethics, or to have their recommendations rejected without regard for the law and for obvious political reasons. Many of the problems that we are witnessing today can be avoided if the proper ethical tone and environment is established and enforced by the people at the top. Next slide, please. Lesson number three. Integrity, honesty, and truthfulness are vital to an agency and its mission. Obviously, these ethical values have a close relationship with each other. Very impressed by this statement that I came across from Edward R. Murrow, a journalist noted for his high ethical standards. He once said about his profession, journalism, to be persuasive, we must be believable. To be believable, we must be credible. To be credible, we must be truthful. Without these values, integrity, honesty, and truthfulness, a governmental agency will have no credibility and its mission will fail. It is obvious when an agency is not doing its job, when it's ignoring the law, when it's not enforcing the law, when it's not following the law. And once that perception gets out among the people, that agency will have no credibility and will ultimately fail. Next slide. Lesson number 4. Government must be transparent, open, and accountable to the press, to the affected public, which is the agency's constituency, and to the general public. The agency's decision-making process should be carried out in public, and its decisions should be documented in public records. An agency should always be able to explain how and why its actions are legally defensible. Admit mistakes when they are made, but be prepared for criticism for admitting the mistake and trying to correct it. I can recall several instances when I was at the department that staff came to me and said, we have discovered that we made a mistake on this particular application, and a mistake involving calculations and mathematics and things of that sort. And they said, now we're going to be subpoenaed to testify at the trial in this case. What are we supposed to do? And I said, well, it's very clear what you do. You tell the truth. And if the department has made a mistake, it must acknowledge the mistake. I can tell you that that decision, that approach, met with severe criticism from those who had benefited from the mistake. But I think a public agency has no choice but to admit mistakes when they're made, try to correct them if they can, but always tell the truth. There should be assiduous adherence to the Government and the Sunshine Law and the Public Records Act. There is no excuse for a public official, a public agency, not to adhere to these laws. A public agency should never have anything to hide, and it should not attempt to hide anything. The agency's business is always the public's business. And some of you, I'm sure, noticed within the last 2 or 3 weeks, we had indictments returned by a grand jury against people for violation of public record laws. I never thought that there was any excuse for that. We do have a Public Records Act that spells out things that are exempt from the requirements of that act. So it should never be necessary, really, for a citizen to have to sue an agency to turn over records which the agency is obligated under the law to make public upon request. Next slide. Next slide. Number 5. Lesson number 5. Avoid even the appearance of conflicts of interest, something that has been mentioned both by Val and I think Susan. From personal experience, I can tell you that failure to do this can be very painful. In my early days at the department, during my initial tenure, I was reviewing my daily mail packet. I came across a letter that requested that the department issue a DRI binding letter, a binding letter of DRI status. I took a little Post-it, put it on the letter, and said, handle this, and shipped it on down to the division director who routinely handles such matters. That simple little act, those 2 words, please handle, something that I thought was the most innocent act that you could have, was interpreted by others to mean that the secretary was directing the division director to grant the request, which was not my intention, but because of the sloppy way in which that was handled, I found myself on the front page of the Tampa Tribune for 3 consecutive Sundays talking about my conflict of interest. I think it's important to try to anticipate conflict situations and avoid them. Always recuse yourself from matters in which you have a conflict and document in writing the actions you have taken to avoid conflicts. Agencies which get the reputation of having conflicts of interest and not avoiding them, will lose the trust and confidence of the citizens. Lesson number 6. Don't be an enabler, initiator, or facilitator of unethical action. Those of us who work as lawyers or planners frequently find ourselves in the position of being asked to do things by all manner of people. You can easily enable those people to engage successfully from their point of view in unethical conduct. We need to avoid those kinds of situations. I can point out a number of things that occurred in my second term in the department that involved the enabling, the facilitating, the initiating of unethical action, frequently because of the requests and actions of private sector actors and their interactions with public agency and public officials. One technique that has grown in my experience, based on my observations over many years, is the use of disinformation and misinformation campaigns by hired gun lobbyists. In my last 4 years at the department, I spent an enormous amount of time chasing down wild rumors planted by lobbyists for special interests, whispering in legislators' ears, claiming that the department is doing this or it's doing that, all for the purpose of gaining legislation favorable to the lobbyists. If we're going to have a democratic system that works for everybody, we need to be aware that that kind of conduct undercuts our system, causes people to lose confidence in it. Another thing is the politicizing of the decision-making process. Disrespecting the agency charged with the responsibility of making a decision, never taking no for an answer from the agency, threatening, bullying, cajoling, going over the agency head to higher authorities, for example, the governor's office, and then if you don't get the answer you want from the governor's office, run to the legislature. There are certainly times when the agency decision maker has or may have made a wrong decision, or the law or agency policy is not clear or beyond dispute, or even what the right thing to do is not clear, and review by a higher political authority is in order. But all too frequently, this has become a way of doing business for special private interest lobbyists, a way of overriding meritorious decisions for political reasons and making lots of money for lobbyists. During my last 4 years at the department, I was frequently approached by lobbyists seeking amendments to legislation within the purview of the department's responsibility. Mr. Secretary, we just need a little amendment. Couldn't you please just support this one little amendment? This little amendment is important to our client, on and on. Almost like drug addicts seeking a fix. Usually those amendments were not only for the benefit of its private special interest, but would have done damage to the public interest. Those kinds of situations, I think, occur not only at the state level, but with regard to local government legislatures also. It's very important not to be co-opted by the corrupting culture of money and influence. I think we all need to ask ourselves, especially if we're in the private sector, do we really need to sell ourselves, our reputations, and our expertise to help special private interests gut laws passed to protect the public interest and to rig the rules in pending cases for special private interests who are involved in them? If you are a public employee, it's very important that you not acquiesce in demands by your superiors, that you take action that would violate controlling statutes or agency rules. That may put you in a very difficult position. It's hard if you need a job and you don't want to lose your job sometimes to refuse those kinds of requests. But it's very important that particularly in the public realm among public agencies and employees that there be no acquiescence to demands by superiors that you take action that you know would violate controlling statutes or agency rules or your professional ethics. In those kind of cases, you need to be prepared to resign or be fired or become a whistleblower if necessary. And these situations do arise. And if you have followed press reports around the state in recent years, you know that these situations do occur. I know one situation where an agency attorney in prosecuting an enforcement action brought by his agency won the case, prevailed in the case, and within a week, I'm told, he was fired from his job for having done it so well from some people's points of view. So we have to be mindful of those kinds of situations, recognize that they do occur, and do our level best not to be a facilitator of someone else's ethical action. In summary, I think all of us, lawyers, planners, and ordinary citizens, have to always ask ourselves, do we have an adequate ethical or moral compass? If so, we need to evaluate it periodically and ask ourselves the question, is my ethical compass consistent with those essential values that are essential to our democratic system, or does it need some tweaking? Thank you.
This is Vivian again. I want to thank all of our speakers for truly outstanding presentations. I think it's been very thorough and comprehensive and really lays out, not only what you have to do, but what you should do in the public sector. We are opening it up for questions now. As a reminder, you have a control panel, and on your control panel there is a chat box. You can ask any questions where you type message here, and then you can click on and either send it to organizers, which would go to me, or you can send it to all of the presenters. So we encourage you to submit your questions, and we will answer as many of them as time permits. The first question is a lengthy one, and I will read it. It is in your chat boxes because it went to the entire audience. This probably is for Susan, but I'm sure maybe Tom and Val might weigh in on it as well. Please discuss new provisions re fair proceeding basis for possible abstention from the requirement that officials vote unless they have a conflict of interest per Section 112 Florida statute. And then this is in quotes. If the official decision, ruling, or act occurs in the context of a quasi-judicial proceeding, a member may abstain from voting on such matter if the abstention is to assure a fair proceeding free from political bias or prejudice. End quotes. For example, impact on disclosure of ex parte communication as a means of assuring due process and allowing for vote. Susan, do you want to tackle that one first?
Yes, I'd be glad to do that. We do have a rule in this state, which is not always true in every other state, that you have to vote. You can't just vote not present. And so what it says is you're required to vote unless you have or there appears to be a possible conflict of interest under the relevant laws. And what the change in the statute did was it more explicitly recognized that there can be stricter local standards and that those can be a basis for recusing yourself from voting for a conflict of interest that's not a conflict under state law. And it also says that if the need to recuse yourself arises out of the procedural fairness requirements for a quasi-judicial hearing, you can recuse yourself without running afoul of the statutory obligation to vote. And so I would say that this is not that big of a change from the practical kind of advice we give to our office holders and our board members. The law all along has talked about the appearance of a possible conflict of interest as a basis to be able to recuse yourself from voting. But I think it is beneficial that the legislature has recognized both these local stricter standards as well as the special considerations of a quasi-judicial hearing.
Okay. Does anyone else have anything to add on that question? If not,
Susan's covered it well.
okay, thank you. Our next question is, in your opinions, which local communities in Florida have the best local ethics laws?
I'm the one who talked about ethics laws, and what I'll tell you is that best is a very loaded question, and it all depends on what you're talking about. I mean, Broward has this zero-tolerance gift ban, whereas Miami-Dade and Palm Beach don't. Does that mean they're better? There are other ways in which Broward County is silent and is not stricter with regard to public conduct than these other counties. So there are many dimensions that are being regulated here, and what I find is common to all of these local rules, because most of them involve a training requirement. In Broward County, our electeds actually have to be trained 8 hours every single year. There's not 8 hours that you can spend talking about this stuff, but they do. And what the number one comment I get is, I don't want to spend 8 more hours with somebody telling me that I shouldn't sell myself for a cup of coffee. You know, I would rather see a regulatory ethical context that is engaging on a higher plane, the kinds of aspirational principles that we've talked about. So it's that tension between setting minimum standards that are enforceable, potentially criminally enforceable, as opposed to what we aspire to. I'd be interested in what the other speakers have to say as well.
Tom or Val, do you have any more observations on what you think would be good local laws in Florida?
I don't really, but you know, I have not had the experience of working in a local government that has a very different and significantly, you know, more robust ethical code. I've been very impressed. You know, I know that there's what's it called, the Palm Beach County Congress, yeah, the Planning Congress down there. You know, South Florida just seems to have this very interesting focus on ethics, and for whatever reason. And I know the Planning Congress does a whole day planning or ethics session down there that I've spoken at before, and those sorts of things seem to me that, you know, Susan, you're talking about there's rules, and then there's sort of, you know, this more broader discussion, more sort of robust kind of an approach to really getting into some of these issues. And I thought that was a really interesting ethics session that went all day long. But I'm not familiar with any codes that I would say are particularly different.
Yeah, neither am I. I really haven't had any detailed experience with local ethics codes. I would certainly echo Val's comments about the Palm Beach Planning Conference, which I've also attended and participated in, and it does a great job, I think, of covering a wide range of not only the detailed requirements of ethics codes, but situational ethics delves into all kinds of issues. I certainly recommend that other regions consider something like that.
Vivian, if I could just add one more thing.
Sure.
I agree that the program's great. For those who are interested, it's in November every year in Boca Raton. But I have to add to what Val said, I don't know why. Of course, the reason for this is we went through a period in Palm Beach County where a member of the county commission went to jail because he had a silent interest in property that then the public was going to buy, and he was going to personally profit. We had 3 members of the West Palm Beach City Commission go to jail, including a planner who had his own planning firm in West Palm, or they either went to jail or pled or had various consequences from corruption. Within a very short period of time, 3 members of the County Commission and 3 members of the West Palm Beach City Commission were all investigated, charged, and either pled guilty or were found guilty. In Broward, we have had several examples that I could list, and of course in earlier years Miami-Dade. And so, I think it's very clear why we have these charter-based, which all came out of citizen initiatives, that people wrote these ethics requirements and took them to the voters, and the voters made them law. So I wanted to give that context.
Thanks. As follow-up, does anybody know about any legislation in other communities in other parts of the country that have good provisions that could be applicable for Florida?
From a governmental perspective, generally we are the strictest thing going, certainly from Sunshine Law perspective. But ethically, I'm not familiar in detail with other state systems of ethics rules.
Val, this question is probably best for you. Typically, how many violations of the AICP code are found each year? How many planners are sanctioned for their violations?
Yeah, there's usually a handful of charges, like maybe somewhere, it may be around a half dozen. A lot of those are found to be without merit up front, and like, for instance, one of the examples that the ethics officer gave was there was one planner charged another planner with some sort of an infidelity kind of a thing. It was like, okay, well that's not good, but that actually is a violation of the code of ethics. So you'll have certain things like that, but there's an investigation done, and then it moves on to the ethics officer may be able to kind of reach a settlement agreement, and then some of them may go to a full-blown kind of a with the ethics committee if the agreement can't be reached. In the time I've been the chair of the ethics committee, the last few years, I can't remember exactly, maybe 3 years. There have been only about 2 people, I think, who have actually gotten all the way to sanctions. And so typically, and some of the cases, take a long time to play out. So it's not a lot, honestly, and most of them have not resulted in losing the AICP credential. Sometimes maybe it was temporarily and then you can ask to be reinstated. But there have been certain cases, and I think this one that was mentioned where the planner went to jail might be one of the few that I've heard of from Florida in the last, the number of years I've been aware of this. And by the way, it fluctuates, of course. We had very few cases for a little while, and we thought, oh, this is great. We're, all this ethics training is helping people out, and then all of a sudden we got a bunch of cases. So, so much for that theory, I guess.
Susan, you discussed several pieces of legislation that failed this session. Do you have a crystal ball, and can you predict, is it going to be more likely next session? Are these, provisions that are really needed?
I do not have a crystal ball. I think it'll be very interesting to watch this effort to preempt local regulation of ethics that's stricter. I can see pros and cons on that. As a local government attorney, my knee-jerk reaction is home rule, and we don't want to be preempted, and if we want to be more ethical, you shouldn't be in our way. But there are some real difficulties in the day-to-day management of advising some of my elected officials and staff people who are simultaneously trying to satisfy state, county, and local requirements that sometimes are a little bit contradictory or don't necessarily fit too well together. It can be challenging. And so the argument in favor of preemption is let's have a good standard and have it be uniform. I think the answer against it is not only home rule, but also if you're going to have a uniform standard, it generally tends to be your lowest common denominator. And if local areas of our state are willing to hold themselves to a higher standard, why would we prevent them from doing that? But it's certainly very typical of our legislature over the past several years that every single year, whether it be firearms regulation, whether it be vacation rentals, whether it be limiting our ability to use our, quote, freedom under the new Community Planning Act, there's a huge hunger there to preempt in a number of ways. So I definitely am interested to see where that goes, because that would have a major impact, as you can see in South Florida.
Okay. Thank you. I neglected to mention, and Val pointed out, on your control panel there is a materials box, and this is not our materials box, but if you go on your own control panel, we have loaded the AICP Code of Ethics, APA Ethical Principles, Florida Bar Rules, and also the copy of the PowerPoint. So if you're interested in finding out more details, you can find it there. Whoops. Sorry about that. We had another question coming in. Is volunteering to assist your church in a strategic planning considered moonlighting and hence needs to be disclosed?
Wow. Well, I would say if it's related to planning, I think it should be disclosed. And the reason is that depending on what kind of work you do, you could actually get into a conflict situation on it. If, let's say, you're helping your church do planning, and as you know, there's some pretty controversial church plans that come out. And so you could be involved in something that ends up in the public realm in a situation where your own agency could be, if you work for a local government, could be evaluating that church plan. You could be in a situation where you're on the other side if you work for a private agency. So I understand why you might think that that's not important, but there are circumstances where there could be a problem, and I would say you still should let your employer know and get permission. That's me. That's what I think. What do y'all think?
I think that's good advice.
And I would agree with Val. I note that in the written question it says the church is not located in the city where the planner resides or in the planner where they work. But I would note, depending on how close it is to the boundary, it could have a significant planning impact if all of the trips associated with the services are going to cross that boundary. So I think Val's advice is definitely worth consideration.
Right, and typically if that's the situation, you're probably not going to have a problem getting the permission. So that would be, I think, the way to go. Just go ahead and get it done.
Is it generally a good idea to do this in writing so that you do have a confirmation that you requested it?
Yes, it's supposed to be in writing.
Okay.
According to the code.
Okay. We had a question about the materials, how to access them. All of you, again, have a control panel for this webinar. There is a materials box. you can click on the links within it and pull up the materials. So we've loaded some materials for your information. We do have another question in. Has the American Planning Association considered having a public place that employers could check to see if anyone has been indicted of ethics or other planning charges, or if an employer has posted previous resignations? Is there a hotline or website for blind whistleblowers due to repercussions in mostly public staff?
No, there's not. But that's an interesting question. The process, AICP's process for dealing with these charges has been pretty private, and the reason being largely that you don't want to put something out there where it's clearly baseless. But I will tell you that some of the other professions have a much more public type way of dealing with charges, and we are in the middle, as I said, of, I think I mentioned at the beginning, our ethics officer has been our executive director. That's going to change, at least the executive director's changed, and we have to come to this decision of who will be the ethics officer. And it is possible that you will see some changes in the way some of that is done. We usually proceed very carefully, particularly where things like people's reputations are involved, but I think that if you would, if you have some ideas on that and you would like to send me some suggestions, I'd be more than happy to look at your suggestions on it.
Okay, and I guess the latter part of the question is about a hotline or website for blind whistleblowers due to repercussions in mostly public staff. If an ethics charge is filed against someone, do they find out who it was from, who filed the charge?
Yes. The way it works now, I don't think there is the opportunity to do an anonymous. I don't think there is. To be honest, that preliminary side of it has been handled by the staff, and but my understanding is that you typically do know who your accuser is. Was that question intended to be just for AICP, or was it more general than that?
Val, if you want, I can jump in there and just note that what you're talking about, there's procedural due process aspects of this, and traditionally in any kind of ethics system, you're going to have some kind of upfront probable cause determination, because I have personal experience, I think we all do, with situations where these are politically motivated charges that are baseless, and to avoid the reputational damage that results from that, the initial inquiry is kept quiet. At what point it is opened up and at what point it is published sometimes varies among the different systems of ethics. But sometimes people just say, why shouldn't we open up the whole process? Well, the reason is the person who's unfairly accused trying to limit the damage to them.
Right.
Okay. Well, I want to thank you all again for your outstanding presentations. Does anybody have any concluding thoughts they want to share with the audience? Maybe start with Val and go to Susan and then Tom.
Well, I just I appreciate the opportunity to do this. I think that our profession has really progressed in the last decade or so in terms of our discussion on ethics. And as you know, we have our, a requirement for every reporting period for certified planners for your certification maintenance. So I think, I'm just excited about the fact that that we're having the conversations. And I would say keep your eye out, but we're trying to develop some different kinds of ethics presentations, and so hopefully we'll be able to have some interesting discussions over the next few years.
Thank you, and I agree. I think it's a very good format. I like the way we structured this, where we brought together the laws and the planning rules, and I particularly appreciate the contribution from Tom, because there's no better person to provide that perspective from a long time in public service in Florida, and I think it's very beneficial not to get too down and stuck in the weeds of the details and remember why it is we're trying to do this in the first place. So I'm honored to have been part of the panel. Thank you.
Well, once again, I appreciate very much the opportunity to participate in this particular program. I think we all recognize that there needs to be more attention paid to ethics, and I think this kind of program, the webinar, helps to do that. I think as citizens, we should all be concerned about the future of our country, our democratic system, and trying to make sure that it continues to work the way it was intended to work. And we have a lot of challenges, I think, to deal with in doing that. So thanks again for allowing me to participate.
Well, thank you all. And as a reminder, we're taking a break over the summer from the webinars. If you have suggestions for topics in the fall, you can email me at vyoung@1000fof.org. And there was also a box on the registration panel, and we'll be reviewing those as well. Charles, I just thought maybe you'd want to wrap up for the day.
Thanks, Vivian. Yeah, I thought this was a pretty unique thing, having three fellows of the American Institute of Certified Planners discuss, this kind of topic, plus, Val service, on the ethics panel, and the good information we got from Susan and Tom. I mean, this was a unique panel, and I really appreciate their thoughts and input today.
And Charles forgot to mention, even the moderator is FAICP.
Yes.
Indeed.
That's good.
Okay, well, thank you all again. We appreciate it, and we'll hopefully do one in the future again with you. Thank you. Goodbye.
Thank you.
Thanks. Bye-bye.
Yes,